The destructive power of whatever they're dropping in Tehran is absolutely staggering to behold, to see it physically.
The images coming out of the US and Israeli-led war in Iran have been described as apocalyptic.
It's an absolutely apocalyptic scene here. We've just made it to the Shahran oil depot, which was attacked last night.
Iran says a petrochemical complex and the area around the Bushehr nuclear power plant in the south of the country were also attacked.
Fireballs lighting up the night sky, and those flames have continued to burn throughout the course of today.
Burning oil depots have blanketed Iran's capital in toxic black smoke, causing acid rain to fall on its residents.
Analysts warn the environment is no longer just a casualty of war, but part of the strategy itself, with contamination and infrastructure damage putting pressure on ecosystems.
Subjected to thousands of missiles and drone strikes, Iran and countries in the Gulf are facing not only a humanitarian and economic crisis, but an environmental catastrophe as well. I'm Daniel James, and you're listening to 7am. Today, Dr. Patrick Bushehr, Interim Executive Director at the US Climate and Community Institute in Maryland, on the long-term impact of this war and how it's accelerating the world's climate crisis. It's Monday, April 20. Patrick, way back in March, images of US and Israeli strikes on Tehran's fuel storage were really something to behold. What happened?
Yeah, it was pretty apocalyptic scenes, weren't they? What happened was that Israel struck 4 fuel depots and refineries in Tehran, resulting in massive fires, sending plumes of toxic smoke over the city, which led to these, horrifying scenes of black rain, effectively acid rain on steroids, as the oil mixed with a lot of the effluent that comes from burning oil, especially sulfur and nitrous oxide, but all these other really nasty heavy metals, other combustion products, an alphabet soup of toxins. It was particularly pronounced in Tehran because it wasn't able to blow away all that easily because Tehran sort of sits in a bowl surrounded by mountains. And so the stuff gets trapped in there. And so it's very hard for it to escape and disperse in ways that would maybe distribute those pollutants more broadly and in a less concentrated way. Instead, you really got it falling in a concentrated way right back on the city.
I mean, what specifically causes that? And what can that do to both the environment and people's health?
Usually when we combust fossil fuels, they're in a refined form, right? They've been processed and a lot of the really nasty stuff, the sulfurs and so on, have been stripped out. But this is just, raw crude oil being burned up and sent directly into the atmosphere, mixed with the clouds that were hanging over the city. Those toxins are pretty heavy, right? And so they bind to the water and then they fall back down to earth. And, in the short term, there are reports of respiratory distress, headaches, chemical burns.
Satellite images show fire burning for days at fuel depots, sending clouds of toxic smoke across the city. Residents report headaches, skin and eye irritation, and breathing difficulties as the pollution blankets the capital.
And so the immediate advice was to stay indoors, avoid the contact with the rain, try to clean exposed substances. But of course, that's incredibly hard when you're in the middle of a conflict zone and there's bombs raining down and you might need to evacuate at a moment's notice. Exposure to these chemicals radically increases the risk of cancers, of cardiovascular diseases, neurological disorders, chronic respiratory illnesses. That's on the human side. And then on the environmental side, there's the potential for the accumulation of heavy metals and persistent organic pollutants in the food chain. Acid rain of any kind damages soils, forests, crops, disrupts nutrient cycles. And it deposits all these hydrocarbons and heavy metals onto urban surfaces, which can get into the sewage system, get swept out to sea, imperiling aquatic ecosystems further downriver, not to mention the stuff that blows even further away from the city.
Patrick, your team's analysis found that in the first 2 weeks of the war, 5 million tonnes of greenhouse gases were released into the atmosphere. How do you measure that? And can you put that number into context?
Sure thing, Daniel. So what we found in this initial phase, and we've actually got updated numbers, Daniel, so I can tell you in the first 30 days of the war, we're up to almost 9 million tonnes of greenhouse gas emissions. 62% of that from destroyed homes and buildings, and then a quarter of that from destroyed fuel. And that's one of the things that sets this war apart from others that we've looked at. And like all the conflicts that we've looked at, the biggest component of the carbon impacts of this war are on destroyed homes, buildings, and other infrastructure, which itself causes emissions when those things get destroyed. But really, it's the implied emissions of rebuilding them that cause those numbers to come really, really big. In the case of Gaza, where we've also looked at, the rebuilding emissions are 27 times higher than those from the acute sort of combat operations themselves. And just to put that in perspective, that 8.5 million tons of carbon is about the same as 600,000 Australians per year on a per capita basis, or like double the entire carbon footprint of the city of Newcastle.
Wow. The UN has issued warnings about the attacks on oil infrastructure. Iran has been hitting oil fields and refineries across the Gulf, and Israel hit Iran's largest gas field. What impact are all these attacks having on the water and soil, especially in a region that depends on desalinated water just to survive?
Yeah, I think there's an increasing emphasis in parts of the international community where we're in dialogue with regularly on defining ecocide as a crime on par with genocide.
Israel's military offensive in Gaza is leaving a new layer of toxic chemicals in its soil, adding to those left behind after the many wars that it's waged before.
You could make a credible case that certainly happened in Gaza.
More than 61 million tons of debris needed to be cleared, some of which contains waste, as well as asbestos and other industrial chemicals.
We're seeing aspects of it play out, in the U.S. and Israeli attacks on Iran and in Iran's reprisals across the region. And especially the attacks on critical infrastructure that interfaces really directly with the natural world, like these desalination plants. We see that Gulf countries that have been hit, like Kuwait, Bahrain, Saudi, Qatar, etc., all rely on desalination for over half of their drinking water, in some cases over 90%. And that's in addition to other kinds of water infrastructure that have been destroyed, which result in really degraded sewer infrastructure, which results in, untreated sewage washing into waterways. So from the very acute effects of disrupting water supplies for major population centers all the way to really negative impacts on far-flung marine ecosystems, the attack on desal facilities and other water facilities have serious environmental ramifications.
Recently, Donald Trump has been making threats to bomb every single power plant in Iran. Obviously, those are just threats at this stage and nothing is being carried through. But there have also been strikes in Iran close to nuclear facilities. So how concerned are you about how far this could all go from here?
Very concerned. First of all, I would say that I think that these concerns give lie to the notion that nuclear can be a major component of a green transition, as we see the sort of dirtiness and the potential for environmental devastation that they cause. So putting those on par with renewables for a green transition, I think is very problematic. But in terms of if I'm concerned about the impacts of war on nuclear facilities, absolutely. We've seen this play out, of course, in Ukraine also with the Zaporizhzhia power plant that Russia has been in control of for more than 2 years, and the very precarious situation that it was in during that sort of handover. And so the potential for a nuclear disaster to occur in that way. But there's also, if a nuclear storage site was hit by even conventional weapons, it would spread toxic radioactive material far and wide, making an area sort of like Chernobyl that's effectively impossible to clean up. And as to what the likelihood of that happening is, your guess is as good as mine. I think that trying to predict what Trump is going to order on a day-to-day basis is a fool's errand.
Coming up, how the US tries to hide carbon emissions created by its military. Patrick, your team has also investigated environmental impacts from the war in Gaza over the last few years. So how does that compare to what we've seen in Iran so far?
In terms of the Gaza emissions that we tracked over the first 15 months of the genocide in Gaza, we counted about 31 million tons of CO2 emissions, which is more than the annual emissions of over 100 countries. In Gaza, the largest share, which is over 90%, comes from the destruction and planned reconstruction of 436,000 apartment buildings, schools, clinics, roads, all of the facilities that Israel destroyed. The direct conflict emissions, the bombing, the fuel use, aid delivery totaled about 2 million tons. And then the carbon cost of clearing the 61 million tons of rubble would be another 90,000 tons of CO2 emissions. But it's the sort of everyday operations of militaries themselves, particularly the US, which outspends the next 5 biggest military spenders combined. The annual operations of the US military, we've recently estimated at more than 200 million tons of pollution per year, just in the course of normal operations. The US military is a climate villain of world historical proportions and is really not helping the world meet its climate goals. And so as we are facing a climate crisis, I think this should provide impetus to our policymakers to find alternatives to these sorts of armed conflicts that are resolvable through other means.
Yeah, because around the world, lots of countries are trying to cut their carbon emissions to reach certain targets. And as you alluded to, Patrick, then you have the US military, which emits more greenhouse gases than any other military on the planet. So are the emissions they emit included as part of climate negotiations around the world?
They absolutely are not. And that is by design. Going back to the negotiation of the Kyoto protocols in the early 1990s, the United States has always pushed for an exemption from reporting of military greenhouse gas emissions.
I am very pleased that the United States has reached a truly historic agreement with other nations of the world to take unprecedented steps to address the global problem of climate change. The agreement is environmentally strong and economically sound. It reflects a commitment by our generation to act in the interest of future generations.
Only a handful of countries at this point provide disaggregated military fuel use to UN bodies. That's countries like Germany and Norway. But most major military powers, including the US, Russia, and China, don't report comprehensive military emissions, especially those from overseas operations and conflicts. And so that leaves a massive gap to researchers in academia and civil society like me to try to fill in those gaps. And what we've termed the military emissions gap, where our best estimate is that militaries represent 5.5% of global emissions, which would be enough to make militaries themselves the world's 4th largest emitter if it was counted as a country. It's more than global commercial aviation. It's somewhere around the same as agriculture. So we're talking about a really serious source of climate pollution.
Last year, the world reached its first major tipping point with global warming hitting 1.4 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. And we're now on track to exceed 1.5 degrees by 2030. With petrol and diesel supply chains under pressure around the world, especially in Asia, can we see governments really push a shift towards renewable energy to guarantee their energy security? Or could it actually encourage the reverse and people end up doubling down on fossil fuels, as we're seeing a little bit of that here in Australia?
So I certainly hope that countries have learned the lesson that they should have after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine that caused our last oil shock. Like Germany broke all records in terms of its building speed in order to build 4 new LNG import facilities to be able to bring liquefied natural gas from the US over. And in doing so, probably set back its energy transition substantially to the point where now, where there's yet another energy shock as a result of a war elsewhere, they are now going to be paying the price. Consumers will be, industry will be, government will be, as they try to pay out subsidies to keep prices in check. So there's abundant evidence that transitioning away from fossil fuels towards renewables creates energy security for countries that make those investments. And we see that playing out in places like Pakistan that invested very heavily in renewables following the oil shock in 2022. Even Ukraine, which was the subject of the invasion, has been really accelerating renewable deployment so that they can reduce their dependency on fossil fuels. And so from every oil shock, going back to 1973, it's abundantly clear that reliance on fossil fuels, either imported, domestic, no matter where it comes from, because of the global nature of energy markets, is a security risk to those countries, to their populations, and to their economies. And that only by transitioning to renewables can you remove that risk.
Well, Patrick, it's sobering information you bring us. Thanks for your time.
Cheers, Dana. Thank you for having me. And hopefully next time we can talk under happier circumstances.
Also in the news, accused war criminal Ben Robert Smith has issued his first public statement, categorically denying the allegations against him. Robert Smith lashed out at police for what he claims was a deliberate sensational arrest at Sydney Airport this month. He says he'll now be taking the opportunity to clear his name. The former SAS soldier has been charged with 5 counts of the war crime of murder over the alleged killings of unarmed Afghan civilians and prisoners. And Australians have slashed their spending on fuel for the first time since the Iran war began. Data from Westpac shows over the last fortnight, spending on fuel has dropped by 3.8%. It comes as Victoria announced free public transport for another month and half-price public transport until the end of the year. I'm Daniel James. Thanks for listening to 7am. We'll be back tomorrow.